Okay, so for just to give some background on kind of the approach we're talking about and how this all ties together, this conversation is related to zoning and land use in terms of the short-term rental conversation. The power to do zoning at the local level is granted by the state. And as you can see, there's kind of a general catch-all phrase that talks about why we do the zoning, which generally is to promote the health, safety, and general welfare of the public. In general, zoning is attempting to balance the rights of property owners to use their property as they desire, but not infringing on the rights of the adjacent property owners to do the same or create some kind of undue burden to the public. So zoning generally regulates a number of things. Uses is the biggest issue in terms of what can be allowed on a particular piece of property, but that also can include other things in terms of the size of structures, the scale of development, where buildings may be placed on the site, as well as some site features that kind of go with the site development. Zoning does not regulate certain things as well. So zoning does not get into the interior of buildings and activities inside, other than what would affect the overall property. We don't get into ownership, so the zoning standards are not designed to be different if a property is under ownership versus rental. And then zoning doesn't address behavior as general in terms of some things like noise and cleanliness of properties and those kind of things. So the term short-term rental is actually not currently defined in our land development ordinance. And the way our structure of our ordinance is that if something is not defined, it is prohibited by right. However, the planning director is authorized to classify use that's most similar to some other use that's defined in the land development ordinance. And so how the city is regulating short-term rentals at this point is under the tourist home bed and breakfast provisions. And as you can see on our ordinance, the definition of a tourist home is a dwelling in which lodging with or without meals is provided for overnight guests for a fee. These tourist home uses are allowed in a number of different zoning districts. You'll note that in the single family residential districts, R3, R5, and R7, these uses are allowed only with a special use permit. In other districts, multifamily, office, some of the commercial and mixed use districts, these uses are allowed without a special use permit. So regardless of where they're located, the tourist home is subject to a number of standards under the current ordinance. So there's a spacing requirement between tourist home uses. There's a limitation on how many rooms can be rented as part of that. There's a requirement that the owner or operator of that tourist home resides on site. So effectively that property is used as their residence. That these are located in dwellings. There's a limitation in terms of kitchen facilities. So it's still considered one dwelling unit basically. There is a standard that gets to the length of stay for individuals at a specific tourist home within a certain period of time. That does not translate into how often it can be rented as a whole. That is just for individual stay. And then there is a provision to allow some attached signage to identify that property as a tourist home. So where we have kind of gone from there, this obviously is a topic that is of great interest on a national scale as well as on a local scale. So there was a stakeholder group pulled together led by the mayor to evaluate current regulations in Greensboro and then also take a look at what other NC jurisdictions had adopted. I will note that there are not that many cities at this point that have fully adopted ordinances for short-term rentals, but most municipalities are working on some version of this, or at least doing some investigation on potentially regulating these uses. So our stakeholder group included a number of different perspectives purposefully. So we had a lot of different ways of looking at what we were doing. We did include several current operators of short-term rental property. We had some local land use attorneys that could speak to a variety of issues related to land development, impact, and then also get into questions about how these might relate to homeowners associations and other things like that. Had several neighborhood representatives as well to bring that neighborhood perspective to the conversation. And then we had representatives from several different organizations that deal with a lot of land use and land development here in the city of Greensboro. This group met for about 5 months, starting back in the summer of 2021 to craft these draft regulations, which I will go over now. All right, so the first thing with any use, new use to the ordinance is to define it, the use. So this is the definition we have put together for a short-term rental, that basically it is the rental for a fee or some other consideration of a portion or all of a residentially used property for a period of at least 2 nights and no more than 30 days. The rental could also include an on-site accessory dwelling unit as part of that rental. And then we further break down the short-term rentals by two categories, either a homestay rental or a whole house rental. So the homestay rental gets to renting only a portion of the available bedrooms in a residential property for a fee, and that the host of that rental uses their property as the primary residence and are on site during the rental period. The whole house rental allows for the rental of the entire residence, and the host does not need to use the property as their primary residence. But if that's the case, then a local operator must be identified and then information provided to the city. We additionally define a couple of additional terms in terms of a bedroom, a room being furnished with a bed and primarily used for sleeping. So this does not include common living areas not furnished with a bed on a regular basis. So the idea is that a living room or some other area that's a common area that's not typically used as a bedroom would not be considered rentable from this conversation. Local operator, again, an individual or a property management company with an identified point of contact that can change on a recurring basis. So just before I go through some of the standards that go with this, the general intent of these regulations is we're ensuring that the activity associated with the short-term rental doesn't change the character of that residential property or create negative impacts on adjacent residential uses. So we're trying to balance the desire to bring people to the community and to encourage folks to be in Greensboro, but at the same time, we'll make sure that the level of activity associated with that does not create significant impacts in the adjacent area. So the short-term rentals, the standards have a few things I'll highlight. One, this is only allowed in residential dwelling units. So these would be units that were created for a residential purpose. So we're not talking about converting old office buildings or other things to this purpose. You will be required to have a zoning permit from the city. This permit's basically renewed on an annual basis with an administrative fee. And if there are violations of the ordinance, that permit can be revoked. In terms of trying to account for the level of activity associated with the rental, the standards that are proposed is that we would have no more than 2 adults per bedroom rented. Did note that persons under age 18 do not count towards that maximum persons allowed. And I will note that part of this in terms of using the age 18 is that persons under age 18 cannot rent short-term rental through Airbnb, VRBO, those services on there. So you'd have to be at least 18 and be an adult to be able to rent. So therefore, that's why that's counted in that manner. In terms of trying to also get to levels of activity, if there are gatherings that are publicly announced or promoted through any means, and they involve more than 2 times the number of persons that are allowed on the ratio above, those would be prohibited. So again, this is getting to this is a residential type of use in terms of the activity and the scale, and it's not intended to be that a group stays the night and then has an extremely large event that creates a lot of problems for the adjoining area. We did also, in terms of keeping the residential character of the properties, note that exterior signage is not allowed for these properties. We did mention about local operators being assigned that this whole house rental is not being run by the property owner themselves. That operator needs to be located within 20 miles of the property being rented so that they are within a reasonable drive to get back to the property if issues arrive. And then we will get information of that person and so they can be on call during that rental period. If the whole house rental is done by the property owner, we have that same standard in terms of having that information. And then we are proposing as part of this to build in a period of time after this is adopted of 6 months. This is kind of a dual role. Part of it is to allow the city to get in place some of the things it needs to do in terms of administering the ordinance and making sure people are aware of what the rules are, and then to get the actual permits done and get everybody ready to go within that period of time. So at this point where we are trying to get more information. We're trying to get this information out to as many people as can and get some feedback on what we've got in terms of our approach. There was a meeting, as I mentioned earlier, at 12:30 today, similar to this format. And so we're going to continue to take comments through the end of March and try to kind of see where we are at that point in terms of whether or not adjustments may be needed in what we're proposing. There will be full public hearings on this ordinance change at both the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council level. Again, we don't really know what the dates are there at this point, because we'll have to kind of see if any adjustments need to be made after these initial public conversations. The last thing on this slide is a web address for a website for this project on short-term rentals. Many of you probably were on the site originally to sign up for this particular meeting. We're going to push out additional information from the discussions we're having here and keep everybody up to date in terms of when there will be other opportunities to comment if changes are made with ordinance, or when those public hearings are going to be met. So at this point, I will stop the presentation, and I know Dana's keeping an eye on the chat box. So be happy to try to answer questions and comments that you've got come in. Again, we are going to record everything that is said, or excuse me, that is noted in the chat box, so that we can make sure we capture everything. And if for some reason we miss somebody's question, we can follow up on that. So I'll be happy to try and answer questions for folks. And Dana, I'll let you go from there.
Mike, we don't have any questions or comments that I can see so far.
Okay.
I got some direct message.
Okay.
Okay.
It says, why would a zoning permit be turned down? If I have a separate small guest house on my property, would I be reasonably, would it be allowed to rent that out?
All right, let me start with that question first. So yes, if you have an accessory dwelling unit on the property, that would be an option to rent under the short-term rental regulations. So that would count basically, those ratios with whatever bedrooms are in that accessory dwelling would count towards the amount allowed on the property. In terms of why the permit's going to be turned down, most of the time, and we don't know for sure at this point, but outside of a property trying to get a permit in the area not zoned for residential use, the permits themselves will probably not be turned down initially. What's going to most likely happen is that folks are not going to operate as they're supposed to under these regulations, and then we'll have to revoke that permit. But there may be some instances we're going to ask for some basic safety information to be included with the short-term rentals, in terms of the non-emergency police number, information on when trash and recycling is supposed to be out for folks staying there, so we kind of make sure the property is kept up. And so if there's things that people cannot agree to with that, then that might be a reason as well that a permit wouldn't be issued. All right, I'm seeing some questions coming in too, so I will try and see if I can kind of.
And Mike, I have a question on that was sent directly to me. And
Okay.
I also just wanted to let everybody know we've posted the website again in the chat. Everyone should be able to see that. But the question we have is, why is there a 2-night minimum?
Right. So that is something that the working group kind of went back and forth on, trying to figure out. There is a concern in general with the short-term rentals in terms of one-night rentals leading to events and other things that are going to be problematic for the neighbors. And so the thought was that with minimum 2-night rental, that's more of a commitment, and that would potentially reduce the potential for what has unfortunately popped up in other jurisdictions, some of the party houses and some of those kind of things. So that's where that 2-night minimum came from. All right, I got a question. Let me see if I can get back here. Someone's asking about, they rent their residence out when they're out of town, and how does that get addressed with the verbiage? So I think that we would consider that to be a whole house rental, and that you're not on the property and not part of that rental period on there. So you would just be considered a whole house rental and would be registered as that. We don't have any kind of minimum standard on how often a property is rented to be considered either a homestay or a whole house. It's just simply the question about whether or not you're allowing the whole house itself to be rented or just part of the house. All right, another question asked about the amount for the zoning permit. We have not determined that yet. We are trying to figure out what is an appropriate fee that would cover some of our basic administrative costs that go with this in terms of monitoring rentals and enforcing as necessary. But we want to make sure it's not overly burdensome to short-term rental owners. With that, there's been discussion about whether or not to do some kind of a small flat fee or to do something that is along the lines of the average nightly rental in Greensboro as two different ways we can approach that. We haven't figured that out exactly yet. All right, Allison or Dana, do you have any more? I've got a few more here.
Yeah,
I
I've
do
got a
not.
couple.
Okay.
I've got a couple. We've had the question, can a single unit be divided into 2 whole house short-term rentals?
If it is a single dwelling unit, then no, it needs to be treated as a single dwelling. We do have, duplexes and townhomes and those kind of things that are multiple dwelling units. And then theoretically, those individual dwelling units might be considered a short-term rental because there's no spacing requirement between short-term rentals on there. So if the house is existing as one dwelling, no. If this is a case of multiple units in the same building, then those multiple units theoretically could be all done as separate ones.
All right, we've got the question, how will the 2-night minimum be enforced?
We will be looking at working, we think, with a third-party vendor to help us with identifying and monitoring for those rentals. So there are several companies out now that have kind of created a market niche for themselves that they support municipalities all over the country, and they will do searching online, all the different sites, look for listings on there, and will be able to help us identify where there are listings for just individual nights versus multiple nights on there with that. And there will be sometimes that there are complaints too. As part of our investigation, we'll be asking the operator to provide what information they had in terms of that lease for that time to demonstrate that. I've got one question here that says, are zoning permits given on a per residence instead of a per community basis? I think the question is basically, is there a limitation on the number of short-term rental permits that might be issued in that area? And the answer is no, we don't intend to have any kind of limitation in terms of how many individual short-term rental situations could occur in any particular area of the city. And if that's not the question, please send it in again and we'll answer that for you. I've got another question here that asks about commercial property is excluded. If the property is not a residence now, it cannot be a short-term rental as this is written. But then the follow-up question was whether a house was separated into individual apartments. And again, the answer is if that is multiple dwelling units in the same building, those individual dwelling units might be able to do short-term rentals. Data, you got anything at this point, or I'll keep going on mine?
I do. I've got a list, but do you want to
Okay.
finish up with yours?
I don't know what you've got, so once you go ahead and hit one, and let me
Okay.
untangle my headphone here. Okay.
All right. Well, there is the question, is there a way to apply for a permit before the home is purchased or the title exchanged? And this is an example coming from a realtor wondering about clients who want to run
We don't have the permitting process set up yet, so I don't know fully the answer to that question. No, the permit itself is intended to run with the property versus a property owner. So theoretically, someone could seek to get a permit in advance of closing on a property. We'll have to make sure that they have all of the appropriate contact information and other things on there. I don't know that we have considered not issuing until somebody takes possession of a property, but they'll have to meet some of these other standards that we have to go with it.
Okay.
I've got two questions here I'll try to answer. One question had a question about a special permit and living on the premises. And so they were asking about that is the current regulations. Those do not translate forward into the new regulations on there. So you could have rental in single family zoning on there without a special use permit, and you could not have to be used as your principal residence. But again, we'd have to have a local operator then identified as being responsible for that property and having to be within 20 miles of that property. There's a question about 30-day maximum. So what happens after 30 days under this scenario? Is it just is basically a typical residential lease that you might find in an apartment or something else on there? The city's concern is basically in that 30 days or less period of time, because there's turnover and there's a lot of activity moving in and out of the house. And so that's really the area of concern. When you get past 30 days, it's a little more stable. And so there's less concern from there.
Mike, we've had the question, if the sleeping area is an open loft with a real staircase and a window, and the open area looks out onto the rest of the guest house, does that constitute a bedroom?
I guess the question is whether or not there's a bed up there that's normally used for that purpose, because that's kind of what the distinction was, where we weren't just converting spaces as, you know, you might go visit the grandparents and then throw an inflatable mattress on the floor, that kind of stuff. We're trying to, those don't count. But if that loft space is set up and used as a bedroom space, it might work. We'd have to look at that and see kind of how that relates to the rest of the house. All right, I got, let's see. Trying to see if there's anything on there. All right, there's a question. I think they're asking about why the 20 miles was set up for the operator. And again, that was designed to get to that person isn't within a reasonable driving distance of the property. So if something comes up, there's another point of contact. You know, obviously, if there are public safety concerns or something really big, the police can come out and deal with those issues. But there are going to be other things that come up that would be appropriate for the owner or the local operator to be able to address, and having them in physical proximity, the committee felt like made sense to at least make sure that there's a responsible party that can answer quickly as necessary.
All right, Mike, we've had the question, if the permit runs with the property, wouldn't all of the contact info change? So I guess the question would be, you know,
Yes, theoretically, right. It could. That's one of the reasons that we're setting it up to be an annual renewal, so that there is a checkpoint to make sure that we have this up-to-date information on there. And obviously, if a complaint comes in and we investigate, we'll follow up, and that would be an issue where that permit information wasn't updated and correct. That might be an issue in terms of that permit being revoked, or at least having some issues where we have to enforce. I had a question about the whole house rental and whether or not they had to live in the house to rent the house. The answer is no. You do not have to use that house as your residence to do it as a whole house rental. But again, if you do not live in that house, then you have to have an assigned local operator to work with that. All right, Dana, what else you got?
Does the regulation apply? Does this regulation for short-term rentals apply? And it's a quote. I'm assuming this is for the current tourist home standards. A tourist home may not locate within 400 feet of a rooming house or another tourist home. And the question is, are there any limitations to the number of short-term rentals in a neighborhood?
Right. So that is correct. That is the current standard under tourist home. And the answer is, under this proposal, no, there's no minimum separation between properties that are short-term rentals. I got a question here asking about whether or not this applies to addresses outside of Greensboro, and the answer is no. This is only applying to properties that are in the city limits of Greensboro, because that's where we have our authority to regulate under the land development ordinance. Danny, you got another one? No? Okay, let me see if I can scroll through. There's a few more that popped through while I was trying to do. Okay, let's see. All right, got a question about a home with a basement and its own kitchen. Can that be set up as 2 rental units? Potentially, if they've got that set up where they have sleeping accommodations as well, you'd have effectively an accessory dwelling area within the main unit. So accessory dwelling units can be located inside the residence as well as a separate building on there. Again, we have to kind of take a look at the arrangement and see how that works. Let's see, there was a separate question about renting an apartment. Most apartment complexes that I'm aware of don't allow for subleases in their leases. But in terms of the city regulation, if someone wanted to rent a apartment dwelling, theoretically they could do that with this. There's another question about the 400 rule that's currently in place. How do we decide who gets that rental? So as with many other uses that have separation requirements, it's whoever's there first. And then if that next person does not meet that requirement, they would have to go seek a variance or some other kind of special permission to do that. And again, that's under the existing rules. The proposed rules do not have that 400-foot separation. Anything else, Dana? I'm gonna keep going if otherwise.
We do have a question. Will someone inspect the property as part of the permit process?
At this point, we don't believe that will be the case. We think this what we'll do is that as part of that permit, they will certify that they are doing certain, we'll have a checklist of things that they need to have in the house in terms of from safety standpoint, but we don't have the staff capacity to do on-site inspections prior to issuing the permit on there. And obviously, if they're not doing those things and we find out about that, that would be a reason to revoke the permit.
Got a couple more questions,
Mhm.
Mike. Will special use permit applications require public notice?
Yes, and that again, that's under the current regulations, and they do special use permits do require notice. We send notices out to everybody within 600 feet, and then actually post the property. It's the same sign we use for the zoning cases. I'm sorry, it is not now. It used to be. That's actually under the Board of Adjustment now, so that would be something under the Board of Adjustment. We could advertise with that. But yeah, we do advertise for special use permits.
All right, and a second question. If the operator is further than the 20 miles, if they have team members within the 20 miles, would that suffice?
If that person that's located close enough is identified and can be that local operator, yes. I mean, they would need to be on call and be responsible for that particular property. But yes, that was one of the things that the group was intending to do, is that if that owner of property was a good distance away, they would have to have someone closer within that 20-mile distance that could respond more quickly.
And we have one more comment. The occupancy should be based on number of beds, not bedrooms.
Okay. I think we heard that comment earlier today as well.
And that's all I've got for now, Mike.
Okay. Let me keep reading through here. I got a question about whether a nonprofit needs a permit to temporarily house new refugee families. I guess part of that will be the arrangement of how this works, because again, this is going to be rental for a fee of some sort. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be the case in some of these relocation scenarios on there. But if they are getting a fee as part of that, then yeah, we probably need to do a permit there to allow that rental. And again, to have an identified party. Temporary is a term that would have to be defined, I guess, as well, because again, if this is more than 30 days, then that would be outside the scope of the short-term rental. So if it's more like 2 months or something like that, it would not need to go through these permitting standpoint. All right, question about what if a local operator is on vacation for a few days? Do they need to contact the city every time to change the contact? Ideally, yes. We realize that that's difficult to do in some cases on there, but at the end of the day, there needs to be an identified responsible party that can try to respond if there are issues with that. We understand things come up and that sometimes happens, but there would need to be, I would say to that person or whoever's looking into those things, then they may need to try to identify somebody else and have, messages forwarded or some other way for that to be, for them to be in contact. All right. You got any more, Dana? I'll keep going otherwise.
I do have a couple.
All right.
All right, we've got another comment. By locating the 2-night provision in the definition instead of the regulations, it suggests that one could operate a 1-night rental without needing to comply with those regulations. We do have a question. What if we rent 3 months at a time to nurses, then do short-term rentals? How does this apply for the permits? So it sounds like maybe a short-term.
Yeah, kind of 2 options on there. Right. And I think actually that's some of the platforms are being used for kind of longer term rental options on there. Again, 30 days is the key here. So if you are going to try and rent the property for less than 30 days, then the zoning permit's necessary. If the idea is to try to do short-term contracts, 3 months, 6 months, something like that, and that is definitely something that's been happening on a regular basis, those do not need the zoning permit. So the question really is going to be, if you want the option to do the shorter term rental, then we need to go ahead and get the permit done. If you think you're going to do the longer term, then that's not necessary. All right, I got a question here just asking about what's driving the sense of urgency on this topic. Are we having trouble with short-term rentals? There's a couple different things. This is obviously a use that has continued to increase in every jurisdiction, and there's been lots of questions about trying to create some kind of standards in terms of just some general regulations and general frameworks, so everybody's really working from the same set of information on there. We have had some increased complaints from short-term rentals over time that has come to the city's attention on there. So we're investigating properties on a pretty regular basis at this point, and that we don't feel like the current regulations really were designed for this type of use. They really were designed much more for the classic bed and breakfast, where the owner lives in the basement or on the property somewhere else and then serves meals to the tenants, those kind of things. And just feel like it needs to be clarified, and we need to be a little bit cleaner on how we go about setting rules and regulations for this type of use. All right, we had a couple questions just asking about a lot of different scenarios of bedrooms, configurations. We'll probably have to sit down and look at those and get you a more consistent answer on that. The general idea is those rooms have beds in them pretty much all the time and are used because I know we have guest bedrooms, for instance, that people use for other things like offices and workout spaces and those kind of things, but the bed's in there and it can be used at any time. So those would probably be considered bedrooms. We will not limit the total number of permits granted each year. That was a question that came up. Let's see, I think we answered the question about the traveling nurses. And then the last question I've got here, will a document be given with rules? Yes, so the idea when we have the permitting in place is there will be a checklist, and it will have the development standards that are adopted in the ordinance, and also have, if you're going to operate short-term rental, there are a few other things that you need to do in order to operate it safely. And I think that is all of the questions I see. Allison or Dan, do you see any further questions at this point? Okay, all right. So I'm gonna wait a minute just to see if anybody else is, because I know sometimes it takes a little time to type in stuff. Okay, a question came in about, is it okay to have multiple points of contact so somebody's not stuck in town 365 days a year? That's a fair question, and yes, I think we could have multiple contacts. We just need to be able to get to a responsible party on there. I don't see that being an issue.
We did have a question. What constitutes a complaint from a neighbor about a short-term rental being reasonable or unreasonable?
That's the same question we get about every zoning complaint, actually. So at the end of the day, we get complaints, we're going to investigate and determine if something has actually occurred or not. So we're going to need to, our enforcement officers will be investigating, and we'll be looking at that kind of information like the rental period and how many people were there. If there's evidence that they advertise some kind of event, we check things like Facebook and Instagram and see if there's things out there that announce this address is used for this activity during that time. We'll be talking with the owner as well, or the responsible agent, and get more information on that. So we'll have to make a determination on a case by case basis with that. Most of these types of things are pretty straightforward as far as the level of activity that's problematic, but we do understand that sometimes there's just animosity between neighbors and other things that are really not rising to the level of a zoning violation. And that's consistent with all other zoning provisions as well. So we've had some experience kind of teasing out what are violations and what are not violations. Okay, got a question here about next steps with the process. So again, we're taking comments, questions right now, just to kind of get a general sense of how folks feel about what's being proposed. Anticipate we'll probably be getting our working group back together to go over what we have gathered from these conversations and then decide if there's any adjustments that might need to be made to the proposed ordinance. The ordinance itself, in terms of the amendment process, there will be a public hearing with the Planning and Zoning Commission. And at that public hearing, after they go through that hearing process, the commission will make a recommendation on the proposed language. They have three choices, basically, that they can recommend approval as it is presented. They can recommend approval, but then they may need to make some changes to the ordinance, or they recommend denial of it as it's presented. And then it will go on to city council for an additional public hearing with those same standards and that same decision process. I don't have a time frame for those meetings at this point because part of it we need to kind of get an understanding of where there are questions and things that we might need to address further or any adjustments need to be made. We will keep that website up to date with information. So we'll push out if there are going to be some hearing dates and other things on there. We'll get that out on that website that was provided before. And Allison will probably add it again to the end of the chat when we get to that point. So you'll have that.
We've got another one, Mike.
Yep.
Sometimes a friend will stay in my guest house and have trunk shows in the garden. Is that a zoning violation because it's commercial in nature? If sales are being made, is that?
And I guess I can't ask this person directly. We need to know, I guess, first off, are they renting the space or are they just staying there as a friend, dropping at the house? If they're doing things that are just for their own personal entertainment or the people that live on the property, that wouldn't necessarily be an issue from that perspective. But if they're sending an information saying, hey, I'm going to be doing open mic night Friday, 8 to 10, come to this address, that would be an issue of concern. I hope that answers that question. All right, scroll back through and see if I see any other topics here. All right, I'm not seeing anything else. Dana or Allison, are you seeing any other comments? Okay, well, let's do a last call real quick if anybody else has any questions. Okay, there's another part of that last question. Confirm that special permits are required only for weddings or real events and not just needing a place to sleep. So again, the special use permit is required under the current ordinance for a tourist home when it's located in single family residential zoning. The proposed ordinance does not have any kind of a special use permit requirement, but then prohibits larger scale events. So I guess that kind of balances out those two things. I've got a last question here. Do we know anything about Swimply? It's a pool sharing app. I've heard of this a little bit. I haven't seen a whole lot yet, but I understand that that's a similar concept where you can potentially rent somebody's pool for, I guess, a pool party or something else on there. We'd have to look at that a little bit further to see how that works, because if people aren't staying at the property, I'm not sure it would fall under these short-term rental provisions.
Mike, we've had a couple other questions come in. Will there be a public registry of all short-term rentals? How will neighbors know if the property is permitted?
We will have information through our third-party vendor about where they're located. Whether or not that's actually out in the general public in terms of a map or something else on there. I don't know we'll do that necessarily, but we'll have information that people can, if they suspect there's one there or ask some questions about that, then we can follow up. Haven't really confirmed that one way or the other. Not sure there's a need to go that far, and that's going to change on a pretty regular basis. So what that tool looks like is a question, but we'll have a database at least of where those short-term rentals are. So if somebody has a question, they can contact the city and we'll get that answered for them. And you said there was one more, Dana?
Yeah, there was. I think I answered it to the person, but they asked, when will the permits be required?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the permits will be required at the end of that 6-month period of time after adoption. So I, again, don't have a time frame because we don't know exactly when this is going to go forward to public hearings and adoption. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for taking some time this evening to give us input. This is definitely not the last part of the conversation here. So I encourage you, if you have other thoughts, questions, comments, you can go to the website. There's a link there that will allow you to email some comments. Those will come to me, or you can email me directly for those that have my email address already. Happy to talk with you on the phone, do other things with that. Again, we will try and continue to push out information on the website, hopefully starting next week with some updates on kind of a summary of information we have here, and then let everybody know. We have email addresses because of you needed that for registration. So we can push out some information to the group as a whole in terms of the meeting dates for the public hearings, and we'll post that information as well. And I'm sure there will be other outlets through media, et cetera, on that. So thank you very much for this. We hope that this is kind of creating a good balance between many people that want to get into short-term rental operation and also folks that are wanting to make sure that this doesn't negatively impact their existing community as well. So I hope everyone has a great evening.